Member for Castries South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today was a very interesting day. I think in many ways we've never sunk this low in this Parliament. And Mr. Speaker, I have seen from members opposite, two in particular, the member from Castries South East and the member for Hilaire'S, a nastiness in their approach to the politics which speaks of the DNA of the United Workers' Party. There are some good people in there, but it is a party full of nasty and wicked people, Mr. Speaker. My language is very strong, Mr. Speaker.
Yes,
very strong.
Keep your objectives to yourself, sir.
I will, Mr. Speaker, but a lot of latitude today was given to a lot of speakers on the other side, Mr. Speaker, and I've taken a lot of blows today. But, Mr. Speaker, I will say my piece.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker,
on a point of order.
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the member is calling, and he highlighted the two persons, the member for Hilaire'S and the member for Castries South East, and used the description of nasty. I think that is unparliamentary language, and the member should withdraw the word nasty from his description.
Honorable Member Castries South, I call on you to keep your objectives to yourselves. And you said yes, you're using very strong language. I will ask the clerk to ensure that it is struck off of our record. But those languages are not parliamentary, especially making a direct reference to members in this House. It's not called for, and it's not what we expected to do. Withdraw it, and then I will have our honorable member, and I will have the clerk to strike it completely off our record.
Speaker,
and then we continue.
Anything you ask me to withdraw, I will withdraw. But today, a lot was said to me, about me, including matters not consistent with the standing orders. But they were allowed, I hear all justified, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will focus on contributions made by the member from Hilaire'S, the member from Miku South, and I will end with the member from Castries South East. And Mr. Speaker, I can choose to do like they did. The tone of their contributions, the accusations, Mr. Speaker, but I think I'm a lot better in my disposition than that, Mr. Speaker. So you would not want me to use the appropriate description of them, but I shall, as best as I can, respond to all the issues that they raise, Mr. Speaker. They were given remarkable latitude to deal with all kinds of issues. The member from Castries South has never even referred to the regulations, but he was given all the latitude, Mr. Speaker. And I hope I have all the latitude to speak about a lot of things, Mr. Speaker. The member from Miku South said in opposition they were supportive of the CIP. And Mr. Speaker, I have with me, and the member from Castries South East tried to explain to the people of St. Lucia that there was a deliberate plan by the Labour Party in opposition to affect and to destroy the CIP. Mr. Speaker, an article in The Voice, April 23rd, one of the leading directors of Hindley and Partners castigated the St. Lucia CIP. April 23rd, 2016. Now, Mr. Speaker, let us remember the program was officially launched in Monaco in October 2015. The then Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, indicated that it would be formally launched and open for business from January 2016. From January 2016, the details of the program were announced to the world. I ceased to be chairman in March 2016. So I cannot say so much about the details post-March 2016. post-March 2016. I resigned as a chairman at the ending of March. I think it was March 24, 2016. St. Lucia was in election mode, and the elections was June 6. There was not much time, Mr. Speaker, to be promoting the program globally. There was not much time, Mr. Speaker, to be out there receiving, applications as such. The program was being set up 6 months, Mr. Speaker. A lot of procedures were being put into place, guidelines were being put into place in the early parts of the program, Mr. Speaker. But in April, Henley castigated the program, especially cites lack of transparency in April. In May, Mr. Speaker, Henley issued a statement, Mr. Speaker, that the St. Lucia program was second to last in the world, and the last place program was Dominica, Mr. Speaker, in May 2016, before elections. A coordinated plan between Henley and partners and the United Workers' Party, Mr. Speaker. And those of us that follow regional politics know the role of Henley and partners. And we followed the hearings in the House of Lords, House of Commons, about Cambridge Analytica. And in the presentation of this famous individual, he mentioned the role of Alexander Nix. He spoke of the role of Cambridge Analytica and what's the name of the other company? They have in elections in St. Lucia, and said that Henley and partners were financing elections in the Caribbean. The same Henley and partners that were financing elections in the Caribbean and was involved in the St. Lucia elections in 2011, Henley issues a statement in April saying, attacking the St. Lucia CIP, and you talk about coordinated effort to undermine a CIP. In May, Henley ranks us second to last. 5 months the program has started. And we're second to last in the world, and Dominica is last. The same Henley that is financing elections in the Caribbean. And UWP they do finance UWP in Dominica and UWP in St. Lucia. And here it is, Mr. Speaker. And the Prime Minister said they were very supportive of the program. By February 2017, Henley and partners announced that they're opening in an office in St. Lucia. Is that coincidence, Mr. Speaker? The same company that was exposed in the House of Commons as financing elections in the Caribbean attacked the CIP in St. Lucia in April, attacked the CIP in May, less than a month before our elections, and we are told they are the ones financing. They support parties that will give them exclusive rights to CIP. And in February, they announced the opening an office in St. Lucia. And guess who's the managing director? The Prime Minister's lawyer. The Prime Minister's lawyer. And we are told, Mr. Speaker, that they were supportive of the program and that we are the merchants of doom, Mr. Speaker. We are the merchants of doom, Mr. Speaker. I fail to understand, Mr. Speaker, how one can come and believe and accept that, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister continued, Mr. Speaker, and he said, and listen to it, Mr. Speaker, sometimes you listen to comments and you wonder, does that really make sense? But people say it because they believe some people will believe it. The Prime Minister, the CIP had a requirement to show your net worth is a minimum $3 million. And he said some people were having difficulty in showing the net worth or the assets. If somebody is having difficulty in showing you their assets, that's a red flag. That's a red flag. That's a red flag, Mr. Speaker. So when the Prime Minister says they had to remove it because people were having difficulty in showing it, that's why it is there. And Mr. Speaker, listen to what the IMF said, despite what the member from Ancillary Canaries said. this about those who were nonsense and they were necessary and it was a wrong thing. Hear what the IMF said. These programs entail important reputational and financial integrity risks, which necessitate strict adherence to standards for due diligence, governance, and transparency. The cap on applicants and additional transparency regulations passed by the authorities may help contain these risks. Among these transparency provisions, the CIP unit would have to report annually to Parliament on the activities of the program, including on the number of applications, approvals, rejections, as well as detailed information on the successful applicants. But we are told having a cap is the worst thing we could do. We are told that. And a member from Ancillary is boasting that this was a waste of time, and a member from Castle Southeast, hear what he says. Why would you want to have a cap of 500 when you can sell 1,000? After 3 years of running the program, have they ever sold 500? Have they ever even reached the cap? And the IMF says the cap is a very important tool. And this is why when those provisions were removed, it raised questions about the integrity of the program. That's the simple point we are making. That the changes they made affected the image and reputation of St. Lucia. The IMF said it. These are necessary. But we are being told in grand style, in pantomime, that those things are jokes and them guys don't know business. And we know business. I'm coming to that in a while, Mr. Speaker. Again, listen to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, and I'm wondering whether it is not deliberate misinformation, just knowing if I say it, some people will believe it. The Goebbels theory of propaganda. Remember Goebbels, Mr. Speaker? Goebbels was a very famous minister of propaganda in one of the most ill-fated regimes in the history of mankind. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says marketing contracts were given. Marketing contracts were given. And those contracts have gone on and on and on for years, more than 5 years. Mr. Speaker, the CIP has not been in existence for 5 years. Where did the Prime Minister get that from? And he's saying that to this House, to inform the people of St. Lucia, and members opposite are clapping. Yes, 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 yes. And the member from Ancillary is jumping out of his seat. But is that true, Mr. Speaker? Is that true? And he speaks about Atten. And why would a marketing agent be assisting the governor of St. Lucia to resolve the impact situation? Mr. Speaker, the then Prime Minister said, he said openly that one of the, you do SWOT analysis, one of the threats to our CIP program was the impact situation we had. And a marketing agent who has ties with a very powerful lobbying company offered to assist us to engage a lobbying company in Washington to speak to the U.S. authorities on our behalf. And that was done. And I want to ask the member from Miku South whether or not he has not met with Atten to continue the same work. Whether he has not, and if I have time, I will tell him exactly which hotel, which time it was done.
Are you serious?
But he can always stand up and say it's not true and I will withdraw
Are
it.
you serious?
But Mr. Speaker, he has met with Atten, Mr. Speaker. He has met with Atten, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on the point of order, on the invitation.
No, on the point of order or point of... what was the point of order?
He said a point of order, so let me...
Point of order and an invitation of the minister, of the member of Parliament from Casper South. We met in Washington, D.C. because the company was hired by them, of which the members on the opposite side had an opportunity to have said to the public the same thing they're saying now, if they were legit. And I met with them, and we turned down and declined the offer and allowed the contract to be discontinued.
Prime Minister, you're very mendacious in your statements. But Mr. Speaker, let me continue. Mr. Speaker.
I like your word.
I raise the issue, Mr. Speaker, about why do we need an escrow established outside St. Lucia? And the Prime Minister presented some guidelines, very well written guidelines, for the establishment of an escrow outside St. Lucia. But does it deal with why is there a necessity to do so? The first line says, the developer must demonstrate the inability to open an escrow account within a bank in St. Lucia before they can be authorized. Why would a developer have an inability to open an escrow in St. Lucia? That's what we're asking. Why would there be an inability? And the Prime Minister had an opportunity to explain why there would be an inability.
Self-inflicted pain.
Why would a developer, a multi-billion-dollar, multi-millionaire developer, have an inability to open an escrow in a bank in St. Lucia that he has to be given permission to open one outside? You understand, Mr. Speaker? That was the fundamental question. I wanted to know under what conditions, and I'm not saying it cannot happen, because if a bank is doing due diligence on a developer and find them very shady, they will not allow them to open an escrow account. The program is risky. There are monies received in St. Lucia for the program. There are, but banks are doing due diligence. And the banks will decide, whether or not a developer will be allowed and is trusted, or they have confidence in that developer. And I wanted him to tell me, why would there be an inability, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, the member from Miku South says we have to change the CIP, real estate, because he wants to open it up to schools and institutions of learning. Mr. Speaker, again, you wonder where the Prime Minister, the member from Miku South, the real estate is totally different, Mr. Speaker. There's something called enterprise under the CIP. Enterprise. And under enterprise, there are 7 projects that can be approved. Specialty restaurants, cruise ports and marinas, agro-processing plants, pharmaceutical products, ports, bridges, roads and highways, research institutions and facilities, and offshore universities. The CIP regulations already provide for that. So don't tell me you are changing the real estate option because you now want to open it up to institutions of learning. That's not real estate. And in any event, under enterprise, you can do that already. So what are you really talking about, Honorable Member? The member spoke about the SLP press release and said it's the highest demonstration of irresponsibility to have made such a press release. And disloyalty. Honorable Member will disagree. The St. Lucia Labour Party expressed its position on what was happening in the CIP. And I'm making it very clear, Mr. Speaker, that there was an instance, at least one that I will cite, where an individual failed due diligence. The regional intelligence agencies said to St. Lucia, do not approve that person. That person was rejected by the CIP, and that person was eventually granted citizenship. By who? Mr. Speaker. And the former CEO of the CIP was fired, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order. I can categorically state that no individual exists. Categorically. And that no approvals have been given to people that have been rejected by JRCC. None. And I would like him to, I want to just make that point very lucidly clear. And if he has any evidence of that happening, and in terms of bringing up about the CEO being fired, CEO was not qualified.
CEO was not qualified. Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, the statement that you've made is a very strong one, a very powerful one.
Mr. Speaker.
So I'm just going to say to you,
Yeah.
be very careful from now on.
Mr.
in
Speaker, a
terms
lot
of how
has been
you
said
proceed.
today about me. I'm not saying anything. Can I add more? When the person was rejected, the person asked for a review. A committee was set up to review that person's application. And I will tell you, one of the persons who sat in on that review was the lawyer for that person. Mr. Speaker, all I say. And if the Prime Minister wants, we don't have to do it in public. He and I can meet privately and I can... No? You want it public? And I can give him the Prime Minister knows what I am talking about. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I know exactly the individual that the person, the gentleman, I do know. I know the individual. And that's why I'm cautioning you, okay, that the information that you have is absolutely incorrect. And that at no point, on the basis of the opinion of JRCC, that opinion was gone against. Okay? So I want you to know that there was a process that went through that includes where a person is entitled to be able to go and have an appeal. But the fact is that I can categorically say through you, Mr. Speaker, to the member of Castres South, that that same individual, okay, had the approval of JRCC. And I know that for a fact, and I have that in writing. So please withdraw from making that statement. We would not approve anyone and have not approved anyone that has not been sanctioned and approved by JRCC.
Can I continue, Mr. Speaker? My time is running out.
Yes, you may continue. You may continue, but you put the back and forth between on that particular point. It's going to tie the Parliament into a difficult position to determine who the Parliament should believe at this present time. You've made the point. If there is need for us to come back to this point sometime in the future, that's fine. But you've made your point, and the Prime Minister, though he's objecting to it, he's made his point. Move on from there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. He says he remembered the individual now. So, Mr. Speaker, from the day that happened, Mr. Speaker.
Don't go back to the...
No, I'm not going back. I'm going forward, Mr. Speaker. The whole confidence in due diligence in St. Lucia collapsed. And Mr. Speaker, I would give some more examples, but the time is nigh, Mr. Speaker. The time is nigh, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, enough for the member for Miku South for now, Mr. Speaker. We will deal with this issue in greater detail at another date down the road, Mr. Speaker. The member from Ancillary Canaries raised some issues. And he shouted at me, and he even said, Mr. Speaker, that I should be put in jail, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, you know, in due time, he says, I'll be put in jail. Now, Mr. Speaker, a lot has happened.
We've gone past that statement, huh?
Mr.
No,
Speaker,
I'm not telling you. I'm just saying we've gone past that statement, so let's not rehash it.
Mr. Speaker, for the entire day, other members have spoken. Nobody has interrupted them. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, allow me to make my contribution.
I'm not denying you your right to speak. I'm just saying to you, you're raising something that have been dealt with. I have ruled on that. Statement was withdrawn.
He says just a matter of time before I'm put in jail. Just a matter of time. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't have to chronicle to this Parliament the persecution that I undergo. From people trying to break in my house repeatedly to the threats. I don't have to do it. So, if it is jail I'm going to go to, let it happen, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, yes, repeated. That's Mr. Member for Miku South. Let me, Mr. Speaker, so he shouted at me about the projects, whether they were high-end. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, and I will share with you the evidence that I have in my possession, Mr. Speaker, that the projects which were approved during the time of the St. Lucia Labour Party all met the requirements. The Prime Minister shouted, Boca, did they have any approval? I can tell you from the documents, I just happened to carry an envelope with me with some documents. I actually have, one of the requirements for approval is that you have to submit to the CIP and Invest St. Lucia a copy of your approval in principle to start the project. And I have with me a copy of a letter dated July 27th, 2006. The Labour Party was not in power yet.
What?
You know, Ansmahu Estate Touristic, hold on, Ansmahu Estate Belvedere Soufre, DCA ARN 745-2006. Now imagine that.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, the member is misleading the House. He said the Labour Party was not in office July 27, 2006. Election was in December of 2006.
All right, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the
Honorable
member,
members,
Mr. Speaker.
let's just
Mr.
get...
Speaker,
Yes, yes.
the member cannot come to this honorable House
Mr. Speaker,
and say it was
Mr.
the
Speaker.
UWP that
Honorable
was in
member
office.
Catherine South.
In July of 2000, the UWP came into office on December 11, 2006.
Very well, he will, if that is the case, then he will. Continue, member.
So, Mr. Speaker, one of the documents that had to be submitted was a copy of the approval in principle. I was told earlier today by the member that Boca had no approval. And Boca had approval in principle, Mr. Speaker, from the DCA. And Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, I stand on the point of order. I think it is important that the document which the member is referencing remain a document of the House. Because what I suspect he's referencing...
Honorable, you have to wait.
Mr. Speaker,
You cannot just say a point of order and just start speaking. You realize.
the second document,
Yes,
Mr. Speaker.
He's still standing on the point of order. Now,
Mr.
what's
Speaker,
the point
can
of order?
this document which he's sharing, so that we can verify its authenticity, that it be made a document of the House? Because I suspect, Mr. Speaker, what he has in his hand is a document to change the land use from agriculture to tourism. And I want to verify that it is in fact a principle, an agreement, an approval in principle by the DCA, which he has as it pertains to a planned development, and not... My point of order is make it a document of the House. We want to see it. Please make it a document of the House.
Can I continue?
Continue. You will identify the document you're
Yeah,
referring
Mr.
to.
Speaker, I don't think the member wants me to quote Erskine Mays and who is responsible for making documents of the House. Mr. Speaker, the second point that was made was that it was not high-end. And I have a copy of the Cabinet conclusion, Mr. Speaker, where it was actually said, Mr. Speaker, that it was a...
All I want you to do is to just identify the document.
I said, Mr. Speaker, it's a letter...
Don't just say you have a cabinet conclusion.
Mr. Speaker, it's a letter from the DCA dated July 27, 2006. You understand? July 27, 2006. And it provides approval in principle, has been granted for touristic lands and the design concept to your project proposal to develop the Ansmahu Estate as a touristic resort. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the man is misleading, the honourable member is misleading in the House on a point of order.
Let the man
Speaker, but what's
complete
all the
and
hullabaloo
let
about?
it. I'm just following your statement. You say I've already said the same thing you just said. Allow the honourable member to identify the document. He was doing that, and thereafter we will come
Mr.
back.
Speaker,
if
I
we
will
have to.
repeat the point. The member said that the projects which were approved by the Labour Party did not meet the requirements of the CIP. And I said, Mr. Speaker, that there were two principal requirements based on what he said. They had to have approval in principle, and secondly, they had to be a high end, because he was saying they were not high end. The member for Miku shouted Boca. I showed that I actually have documents that there was approval in principle, and secondly, Boca had indicated that it would be a resort under the Enchantment group of hotels, which is high end. The other hotel was the Shabusha Hotel. And we all agree, and it was a project that was, and by the way, Mr. Speaker, do you know the first project that was visited, the first project that was visited by the member from ancillary countries after the elections? And I have a clip of it somewhere.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on the point of order. I really have to. Mr. Speaker, the document...
What is the point of order?
Which the...
Honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Castries South continues to mislead the House in his entire presentation. The document which he's referenced is a clear indication that he's referring to a change in land, use of the lands from agriculture to tourism lands, and not, Mr. Speaker, an approval in principle on a resort development, which is a different matter altogether. And so, Mr. Speaker, in order for you to get from DCA an approval in principle on a tourism development, you would have had to submit some drawings. You would have had to submit, Mr. Speaker, a master plan. Okay? But what he's referring to and what he's quoting, and hence the reluctance to share the document with the rest of the House, he's quoting, Mr. Speaker, a document from the DCA, which clearly says that they approve the lands to change from agriculture to touristic, which is totally misleading this House. And so, Mr. Speaker, I appeal with you again, for a matter of verification, please make the document a document of the House. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, there's no standing order for that, Mr. Speaker. But I don't mind, Mr. Speaker, you reading the documents and you ascertaining as the presiding officer whether this letter does not speak of drawings. It does not say to the designer, you can come and collect the stamped drawings, and it says anything resembling what he says. This is gross disrespect of the House. I don't mind you reading it, Mr. Speaker, and return it. I'm under no obligation to make it a document House. But, Mr. Speaker, I'm quite willing to share it with you, Mr. Speaker. But it is, as you can imagine, Mr. Speaker, the nature of the document. But the member is very forthright in his accusations, Mr. Speaker. I cannot make statements like that and get away with it. But it's done with wanton abandon, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the second point...
Let me just inform for clarity. Let me just inform the House that the document is not one to shift the land use purpose, but for one for touristic development.
So, Mr. Speaker, it just shows you the mockery that is made of this honorable House, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the other point that was made about the Boca Estate, the other development was the Shabusha Hotel. As far as I know, it was a high-end resort. Range was building a Ritz-Carlton.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
Yes,
on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, the honorable member for Castries South is telling this honorable House that a submission made to the DCA for an approval in principle in 2006, and when CIP was introduced in 2015, the legislation, and in 2016, the project was launched, that 10 years later, that CIP board can sit down and approve a project that was approved 10 years before we had even started dreaming about CIP.
Nothing happened.
And
Up to the date.
and you mean after the 10 years, it was still approval in principle? No drawings after 10 years? Nothing. And all of a sudden, Mr. Speaker, it emerges and it becomes a CIP approved project on the basis of an approval in principle 10 years before. And I'm supposed to accept that as being transparent in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, the information is very questionable by the member for Castries South.
Honorable member, I accept your submission, but the question is, I'm not here to rule on policy of succeeding governments. That is not my role. All the member did say was that at the time, he said the development had an approval in principle, and he said that one of the guiding principles for CIP at the time. And so he made a reference to the letter to indicate that at the time they had CIP, they had approval in principle. I'm not here to rule on whether it was right or wrong, but I'm just saying.
Can I continue, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, why doesn't that happen to all the other speakers in the House? Why am I the only one that must be subjected to those frivolous, interruptions, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, can I move on to the Prime Minister?
Honorable member, I say keep your objectives to yourself.
Keep my objectives. I'll remember that. Keep reminding me, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure I shall falter from time to time. Mr. Speaker, the member from Miku South came into this House earlier today and circulated some documents, tables, comparisons of CIP. Mr. Speaker, he never said where he got it from, the source of the document, the authenticity of the document. The same member who's asked for documents before they be made documents of the House, that the authenticity be established, Mr. Speaker. But let me just raise a couple questions about it, Mr. Speaker. Can I just beg that you refer to the document, Mr. Speaker? There is one that says comparison table of all CBI programs. An application profile, single applicant. Single applicant, right?
Documents, let's go by. Is the colored one?
There's a colored one, not the colored one. We won't have time to go for the colored one.
All right.
I just want to make a simple point on it. Why you cannot trust much of what comes from the other side. So, Mr. Speaker, it says St. Lucia, single applicant. Total investment costs non-refundable. Real estate, 18,130. 118. You go to our regulations. Non-refundable processing fee, 2,000 US. Applicant non-refundable administration fee, 50,000 US. Due diligence and background check fees, 7,500 US. If you add it, it comes up 59,500 US. How did this 118, where did that come from? As a non-refundable. And then it goes on, Mr. Speaker, that the real estate investment for St. Lucia is 330,000 US. I go back to our regulations, Mr. Speaker. I go back to our regulations. Applicant, single, 300,000 US. But who is advertising these figures, Mr. Speaker? Who? And who is bringing it into this House as an authentic reflection of the cost? Maybe I'm missing something, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let's put that on aside for now. Because, well, I guess the point has been made, Mr. Speaker, that the member from Microsoft presented that to us as the authority and the reason why the fees had to be changed. But all the figures in there are different. Maybe there is a valid explanation. I'm always prepared to give the honorable member, the benefit of my generosity, although I don't enjoy it in this House. But should the matter be referred to a subcommittee of the House? But, Mr. Speaker, nowhere in this document you see any indication where it came from, its origins, its authenticity, and it's presented to this House, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let's move on, because I have to respond to the member from Hilaire'S Southeast.
Honorable Member Hilaire'S South, your colleagues are preventing me from hearing you.
Everyone on the other side is silent now. Silent.
Continue, sir.
I am can I tell you, Mr. Speaker, I don't feel happy when the other side is silent. I don't feel happy. I like when the other side. So, Mr. Speaker, let me move on to the member from Hilaire'S Southeast.
Honorable members.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Hilaire'S Southeast.
I'm just trying to get the House back to some quietness.
The fright of
Leading
silence,
silence.
yeah. So, Mr. Speaker,
Okay.
the member from Castle South has said a lot of things. And you told me don't use certain adjectives and keep them to myself. But, yeah, for now, Mr. Speaker. For now, Mr. Speaker. I don't want the time to run out on me, and I need to address some of the critical points raised by the member from Castle South East. And his presentation, Mr. Speaker, I must say it was unbecoming, as far as I am concerned, in this House, Mr. Speaker. It was really unbecoming, Mr. Speaker. But I will answer him on some of his points, Mr. Speaker. He first made reference, Mr. Speaker, to the Dominica housing program. And he was pontificating and he was lecturing about how, you know, Dominica, if they did not make the change that St. Lucia is making, would not be able to have housing. And he's so wrong, Mr. Speaker. He's just saying anything, anyhow, Mr. Speaker. The Dominica housing program is not funded under a real estate option, Mr. Speaker. It is not. And I'll give the Prime Minister credit for one thing, Mr. Speaker. You know, when the Prime Minister had announced that he was setting up a sovereign fund, I actually support a sovereign fund. And I thought if he could find a way to link CIP to a sovereign fund, that would be a brilliant move. Granted, what he did after was a total disaster. It resulted in we having to pay range millions of dollars. But Mr. Speaker, whoever had suggested this to him actually gave him a very good idea. Mr. Speaker, Dominica right now, today, at this present moment, was handing over almost 60-something houses to people in Dominica. And it was not under the real estate option. You can build houses for the people of St. Lucia under the National Economic Fund. You can. You can do it. Well, if you can design a way, and I know you're very creative in your accumulation of wealth, you will be able to do it. But I am telling you, Dominica that you cited as an example, you were wrong. And you were very wrong. And you were misleading this House and misleading the people of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order. On a point of order.
Honorable members.
The member for Castries South cannot say or cannot prove that I was misleading the House by citing what Dominica is doing today. For the simplest reason, Mr. Speaker, a government can launch a project, and if you get an investor who's willing to come in and sell CIP to build houses through a real estate project that you can donate to the people of St. Lucia, is not far-fetched or out of the league. And the point I was making, Mr. Speaker, is that in expanding the reach of that program by widening the areas in which you can do the real estate project, it can give you the opportunity to be able to do housing as Dominica is doing housing and giving to its people. Not the source of funding I was recommending for what Dominica did. So, Mr. Speaker, in him trying to interpret what I said, he is completely misleading the House. Because we have had discussions about the possibility of engaging in a program of housing construction to the poor and the needy in this country, and to do it through a real estate project. So the member cannot say that what I said is misleading the House. He may be on a different tangent, but not to say that what I'm saying was misleading.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad I'm on a different
tangents,
tangent.
right?
I'm glad I'm on a different tangent.
Parallel lines.
Parallel lines, Mr. Speaker. Because the member from Castle South East made a statement, which was a powerful statement. He said a leopard cannot change its spots.
That's standard.
He said it about you, but I think he was also in a Freudian kind of way, Sigmund Freudian kind of way, speaking about his own self, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, he said in his presentation, he expanded the boundaries of the debate, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, well, Mr. Speaker, this is the same member, Mr. Speaker, whose brother was on television, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable
Mr. Speaker, you saying honorable when it was being said about me,
No,
Mr.
no, no,
Speaker.
no, no. That's
you
not
wanted
what,
me to
no,
stomach
listen
it.
to me. Listen to me.
But you don't want
Are you
me.
going to divert every time a member makes a
No,
statement?
Mr. Speaker. The honorable member said a lot of things. He said we did not understand how to use money. He said we did not understand, and he said so, you know, about basic common sense in business. This member from Cass's office has a lot of sense in business. CNTS, Mr. Speaker, a lot of sense in business. This is the same honorable member, Mr. Speaker, who signed how many direct purchase in one day. That's his basic common sense in business. He, Mr. Speaker, stood in a press conference awarding a check, Mr. Speaker, for CHTTI. And when he was challenged, he said he can build as many schools as he wants for his wife. That's his basic common sense in business. And he says, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker,
Oh, you
on a
want
point
to
of
stop me
order.
now?
On a point of order, Mr. Speaker, I want the member to bring the evidence that I was issuing a check. Mr. Speaker, I have never issued any check. And the member has to withdraw that statement. If he can bring anything to show where I was handing a check to my wife. No, Mr. Speaker, if he cannot provide it, he has to withdraw that statement.
So, Mr. Speaker,
Continue, sir. And try to stay. No, you don't
I am trying
divert
to
every
stay.
time a member
Mr. Speaker,
stands and makes a...
this is the same honorable member that a letter was circulating authorizing Pajua to raise millions of dollars. That's the common sense in business the honorable member is speaking about. That's the common sense, Mr. Speaker. And he challenges us on this side, and I'm proud that my colleagues are not involved in that kind of common sense in business. I'm proud of it. Pajua, today we are waiting for the report on the investigation, Mr. Speaker. The same member who stood on a platform and he says he doesn't send people to commit his crimes for him, he does it himself. And he tells us we don't have common sense in business. And he wants to accuse me, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
You just started asking
Mr.
points of
Speaker,
order.
on a point of order again, Mr. Speaker. The member is saying, making a lot of false statements. This member never said that he's committing crime himself. I said if. And that is the operative word, if. So if the member is going to quote me, Mr. Speaker, he has to quote correctly or he has to withdraw that statement.
I agree with you.
What exactly you said? What did you say?
Honorable member. Quote.
Mr. Speaker,
If you quote him,
I didn't quote him correctly.
If you quote him, quote correctly.
Mr.
The member
Speaker.
has never said that he's committing crimes.
Okay, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and if I quoted him wrong, let him stand again. The honorable member...
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I want the statement withdrawn.
Okay, what exactly you want withdrawn? And I'll withdraw it. And I'll withdraw it. What do you want withdrawn? I'll withdraw it. I'll withdraw whatever he wants me to withdraw. So
The
I can
statement
continue.
you made with reference to that the member said on the platform that he's committing crimes himself.
No, he said he would not go he will not send people to commit crimes. If he have to commit a crime, he'll do it himself. And he just said that's exactly what he said. So what do you want me to withdraw?
Is he on point?
Mr. Speaker, his first statement was that I committed crime. That was his first statement, and that is the statement that he did to withdraw.
Okay, I withdraw. Mr. Speaker, it's the same member from Cass's office that said on a television program, and if my memory fails me, he can correct me, at the CDP to the Taiwanese, he had to pretend that projects were completed in order to get money, Mr. Speaker. That's his common sense in business. We don't understand the CIP. We don't have common sense in business, Mr. Speaker. But he does. And I can withdraw it if you want me to withdraw it.
I'm just trying to get your members.
So don't worry about my members. They're all right, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must tell you, the honorable member spoke about the National Economic Fund. Mr. Speaker, in June this year, we had a debate in this House about the National Economic Fund. And I stated then, and I still believe, it's one of the worst pieces of legislation ever to come to this House. It institutionalizes malpractice, at least the potential for malpractice. And since he presented it, let me just refer to it briefly, Mr. Speaker. The National Economic Fund bill that he speaks so, or is it now legislation that he spoke so highly about, this is the most irregular piece of legislation. Hear what it says, Mr. Speaker. The functions of the fund are to advance loans for government-approved capital project. To advance loans for government-approved capital project. So here it is, Mr. Speaker. A contractor wants to build a road, which is a government-approved capital project. So he goes to the Minister of Infrastructure and he gets a contract to build it, build finance, whatnot. But he doesn't have money. But that Ministry of Finance must pay him monthly or quarterly payments for the road he's built. But guess where he's getting the money? He goes to our CIP money. To take the money, to then build a road for government and to charge government. You think he will ever charge government less than what he has to pay the CIP Economic Fund? He won't. Otherwise, he'd be making a loss. He would be making a loss. If he's taking a loan, Mr. Speaker, to build a road, he must make a profit, of course. And he'll make a profit by charging government an appropriate fee for him to make a profit. So we are taking our CIP money. Rather than build a road ourselves, we're going to give it a loan to Fresh Start, or whichever one, to build a road, and then to charge government for building the road. This is the National Economic Fund. This advanced loans, Mr. Speaker. Here another provision of it. To purchase government bonds. To purchase government bonds. And you know what it reminded me of? There's a technique that's used in the music industry. You release an album, the recording company goes out, they buy all the records, and they say 1 million copies have been sold. Platinum. Hit. And everybody rushes to buy it. So you're going to use CIP money to buy government bonds that government now has to repay how? I mean, why would government use the money to go and buy bonds to implement projects? And the more, Mr. Speaker,
On a point of order.
What point of
Let
order,
me hear the
Mr.
point
Speaker?
of order, please, sir.
Mr. Speaker, the member from the opposite side just said that in fact he applauded me for considering that we're going to have a sovereign fund. The economic fund is acting like a sovereign fund. That once the money goes into the economic fund, Mr. Speaker, and it clearly states so in the legislation, that all it can do is to lend the money out. And the point is that when it lends the money out, the value of the asset remains with government. So if government chooses, instead of reducing debt and paying down on the debt, it wants to convert longer-term bonds that are at a higher price. Both the state is going to benefit, but also the value of the economic fund remains intact. So if the member is going to say on one hand that he applauds us for looking at a sovereign fund, and the economic fund is set up exactly like a sovereign fund, then you can't come out and start criticizing it from that perspective. So please read the act in its entirety and understand that it's acting like a sovereign fund. It is lending the money to do capital projects. Lending is the active word here. And therefore the money has to be repaid back to the sovereign fund. So the asset value of the sovereign fund remains intact at all times, exactly like a sovereign fund. Sovereign funds in Norway do the same thing. They lend money to other entities in order to keep the value of the sovereign fund.
Can I continue? You know, Mr. Speaker, he says it acts like a sovereign fund. If it quacks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it smells like a duck, then it's a duck. A rooster cannot act like a duck. A sovereign fund is a sovereign fund.
Yeah, but roosters can lay eggs though.
Roosters can lay. Mr. Speaker,
Roosters lay eggs.
this is a national economic fund. This is not the sovereign fund. And Mr. Speaker, listen to this, Mr. Speaker. Hear what this, and the member from Castle South East said this was a brilliant creation of his government. Hear what frightens me about this, Mr. Speaker. Listen to this, Mr. Speaker. In deciding the grant or refusal of an application, the board shall, after consultation with cabinet, take into consideration the credentials of the person and information related to the government capital project. Since when? You have to give somebody a loan. You have to go and consult cabinet. When you go for a loan in any bank, the bank doesn't go and consult cabinet. If this is a fund, open, transparent for people to seek funding, do you have to go to cabinet to get approval to give somebody a loan from the National Economic Fund? We all know who are the people that will get all the loans, Mr. Speaker. We should not be frightened to say what it is, Mr. Speaker. And I don't have time, Mr. Speaker, to go through all the provisions of this National Economic Fund. But I can tell you, the St. Lucia Labour Party will immediately, amend this thing. This cannot stay on the books in St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I heard the member from Castle South East taunting the people of St. Lucia and members opposite and asking, you hope we all come to the race on December the 13th, the DSH, the Peter Cup, I think it is called. And Mr. Speaker, I must tell you, well, I don't know if they ban justify. Mr. Speaker, it is painful, Mr. Speaker, that the member from Castle South East will be taunting us about the DSH race coming up in December. Mr. Speaker, at a time when in this country,
Honorable leaders,
at a time when, Mr. Speaker, our CIP money can be used, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we transition to OKEU and solutions are granted a better service in healthcare. Mr. Speaker, every single member in this House, and I'm sure almost every single person listening to me, can speak of the horrors that solutions are going through healthcare in this country. The member from Castle South East stood up month after month, press conference after press conference, saying all the things they will do and when it will start, and this and that, and national health insurance, Mr. Speaker. And we now, Mr. Speaker, almost 3.5 years into this government, and our people are literally dying at our medical institutions, Mr. Speaker. They are dying. And Mr. Speaker, if I had time, I would recount experiences of my constituents, Mr. Speaker. We have seen photos coming out of VH, Mr. Speaker, the conditions that people have to go through, Mr. Speaker. And what the member finds amusing is to boast about the DSH race, Mr. Speaker. I saw the member from Miku South post pictures of the stables and how beautiful and advanced and spacious they are. And I wondered, Mr. Speaker, a short distance away at the George Odlum National Stadium, Mr. Speaker, that the horses are enjoying better conditions at DSH, Mr. Speaker, than St. Lucians are enjoying at St. Jude Hospital at the stadium, Mr. Speaker. And you want me to come to a DSH race in December, Mr. Speaker? That's what you want me to do? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I think, Mr. Speaker, is an insult to the people of St. Lucia. And we had to use St. Lucia taxpayers' money to build the road, Mr. Speaker, to facilitate the racetrack, Mr. Speaker. And we know what we were told in this House, and all the members opposite clapped. It was a road that has been built because of the new airport that will be built, and it requires this, and it's vision we have. This is the same government, Mr. Speaker,
Can you give us an update?
that boasted, Mr. Speaker, that they were the executors. They are literally the executors, Mr. Speaker. They said they would be implementing projects. We were promised 10 hotels in the first year. How many in the second year? 5 in the second year. We were promised so many things, Mr. Speaker. More than 3 years, solutions are waiting, Mr. Speaker. Our CIP is in crisis, and persons are laughing about the upcoming DSH race, Mr. Speaker. We were told, Mr. Speaker, we were told about school repair. And I must say to you, when I heard $10 million will be spent every year and Labour Party barely spent $2 million, I was like, wow, this is serious business. But I did not know that 2 million under Philip J. Pierre goes a lot further than 10 million under this present government. That 2 million, that 2 million goes a lot further than that 10 million. Because every year, how many schools, Mr. Speaker, never before have we had so many schools not able to open at the date of school opening. And you know what? We've had 2 sit-ins, Mr. Speaker. And the member from Miku North has not found it fitting to come to this honorable house and make a statement about the opening of school and the conditions of schools in this country. I can tell you one thing, Mr. Speaker. I am sure if the monies were in the Department of Infrastructure, I probably would have had a lot more confidence in what has been done with it, Mr. Speaker. And I'm being genuine, Mr. Speaker. I'm not just, making the honorable member feel, good about himself. But I know it would have been that bit better. I heard about the Sports Academy. A national disgrace, Mr. Speaker. And the honorable member from Cash's office wants to laugh and smile and talk about business sense, Mr. Speaker. After school opened, they started to put tractors at the Sports Academy to start preparing the facility. Where are the children now? They moved them from the school to the pastoral center, and I think they're back at their homes now. And you talk about you are the executors, paying Pimandu over $15 million to suppose to give you the vision of where St. Lucia has to go and will reorganize planning and implementation in St. Lucia. Are we seeing St. Lucia seeing the benefit of that money, Mr. Speaker? And the honorable member from Cash's office wants to laugh and taunt us how we are failures and they are the success stories. Are St. Lucians feeling a success story, Mr. Speaker? Are they? Monies have been taken off, Mr. Speaker, to build roads, gas tax to build roads. And I'm begging, and the honorable member every now and then sends a potholing crew, Mr. Speaker. Where are the roads that have been built, Mr. Speaker? Where are the roads that have been built with our gas tax money, Mr. Speaker? Tell me. And the member from Cassie South East wants to smile and laugh and accuse people, Mr. Speaker. So less, Mr. Speaker. So less, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I heard a clipping from London. The Prime Minister said crime is on the decline in St. Lucia, and we have CCTVs, cameras operating from Castries all the way to the north, tracking criminals. I'm sure I heard that. I heard it, Mr. Speaker, in the background playing. Somebody was playing it and I'm listening. And I'm saying, is that the St. Lucia that I live in now? That crime is on the decline. The member from Microsoft promised us that Kenny couldn't do it and he would do it. Yes. He would do it. He would solve impacts. He would solve crime in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, are we enjoying this? So when we stand in this house and we say to them, we do not trust the changes that you are making, because those changes are going to further affect the image and reputation of St. Lucia. We know what we're talking about, Mr. Speaker. Yes. We know what we're talking about. And the honorable member from Cash's South East will want to accuse me. I'm not saying much on that. I will get my day of glory. And when I have my day of glory, the whole of Cash's South will party, Mr. Speaker. But this honorable member, a talk show host, repeatedly says live on the air that the member tried to bribe him, and nothing has been done about that. If somebody says you tried to bribe me for $1 million and it's not true, I will sue them. And that was your colleague. And you want to stand and accuse me, Mr. Speaker, and tell me about you cannot trust my judgment on CIP, Mr. Speaker, whilst there is a present investigation in Miami, the Ascenza investigation, that involves the member from Cash's office, Mr. Speaker. And he wants to stand here and cast aspersions, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, I want the member to show which investigation that is going on in Miami that includes me. If the member cannot show that there's an investigation going on, then he needs to withdraw that statement.
Honorable Member Castries South.
Mr. Speaker,
because this is casting us.
Mr. Speaker, we have tried to make the document a document of the House before. It has been stopped, Mr. Speaker. And if you want, Mr. Speaker, at the next sitting of the House, I will table the documents that led me to say what I said. I can promise you that. I will come to the next sitting of the House. Until such time, I will not repeat it. But Mr. Speaker, if you want me to withdraw it, I withdraw it, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, when the honorable member comes until the next meeting, And Mr. Speaker, I promise you I'll make it a document of the House. And Mr. Speaker, the honorable member of Cassio's office comes and smiles and shows us all his teeth, Mr. Speaker, as if it's a joke, Mr. Speaker. This is about serious business, Mr. Speaker. Serious business. When we, Mr. Speaker, stand in this honorable House and we raise question of the members opposite, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, you don't need protection at all.
I've been battered and bruised all day, Mr. Speaker. I can take it. Mr. Speaker, you see, when we stand in this honorable House and we, Mr. Speaker, raise those issues, we do so because we believe we are the custodians and the protectors and the guardians of good governance and accountability and transparency. I was generous enough to say, whereas I want the regulations to be reinstated, I leave it to the government to decide the policy as to what fees that they want, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, if after all the jobs I've had in my life I cannot buy a vehicle, then it was totally useless. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, can I continue, Mr. Speaker? Continue. So, Mr. Speaker, I will not be distracted. We stood in this House because we are the guardians of this democracy. We are the ones that's supposed to hold the government to account. And we have every reason to believe that the image, the reputation of St. Lucia as it relates to CIP has been undermined and damaged. And Mr. Speaker, I stand by our motion that the regulations should be reinstated. Thank you very much.